Okay, let's get going here. Everything looks good there. All right. Do I have a question slide here somewhere? I forget. Ooh, okay. That was a question from last time. I got to get into the topic more before I go back to that question, but I will go back to it. Okay, so last time, what were we talking about? So we're talking about fertility, right? We're talking about especially the declining fertility that we see sort of generation to generation, especially, well, I mean, in Western countries, but it's happening sort of broadly all over the world now with a few really particular exceptions. And so we're talking about this theory from Kurtz as to why this is potentially happening, right? And he had outlined sort of these 5 areas that make up the conventional explanations for why fertility would be declining. So we talked economics, we talked housing, we talked religiosity, and why essentially none of those fit. And we sort of left off with contraception. Okay, this is the question. Is it possible that the new higher levels of self-centeredness and short attention spans is a reason people are having less kids? You mean the bad self-centeredness? I mean, potentially, right? And this is certainly like, Lisa Strawshine, who teaches in the department here, and she teaches in, sort of health and wellness, sociology of health and wellness. When she's interviewed by, people about dropping Canadian fertility, she's like, yeah, children fulfill this particular role in people, right? We want to see ourselves in little tiny people, but you don't need that many, people to fulfill that kind of sense of, having kept the world going or whatever it is, or finding yourself through your children. 1 or maybe 2 kids is enough. So that's possible. In terms of the short attention spans, I mean, I think you would probably be better to focus on something like materialism, right? How materialistic people are, and the fact that material desires and children often don't go well together because children are difficult and expensive, right? And it is probably harder, in the long run to have children and high material expectations, because one of those 2 things is going, especially let's say if you want to travel a lot, children are going to get in the way of that because traveling with children is really, really expensive. Wow, the collection of water bottles that is here is growing every single week. Do you need a water bottle? There's one right there. Okay, so we were talking about fertility, and specifically, right, when we're talking about the collapse, we're talking about contraception. Okay, one of the things that Kurtz notes, and again, I've kind of noted this at other points in the course as well, is that with the exception of the silents, right, and their children, the baby boomers, fertility had been dropping in Western societies for quite a long time, even prior to the advent of the birth control pill. Now, Kurtz has this chart of total fertility, in the UK. I don't know if I can't blow that up. Oopsie. I wanted to blow that up a little bit. But you can kind of see, this bottom chart's a little clearer, right? You see France, right, drops off long before England and Wales, which is interesting, right? Somewhere around the late 1700s, so right around the time of the French Revolution, and then Napoleonic rule, and all that fun stuff with France. Fertility in France dropped off even as England and Wales kind of grew. But long before, so towards the end, like the 1890s, towards the end of that 19th century, or 70-ish years before the contraceptive pill, you see a sharp decline in fertility in England and Wales, right? And this only goes to 1925. So you see it happening well before the advent of the birth control pill, where fertility was dropping. Now here it's still, by modern standards, relatively robust at 3 children per woman, by 1925. But by kind of historical standards, it's low, and this is low despite there being very little reliable contraception available. Okay, So I think, and I think this is sort of, Kurtz doesn't say this, but I think what we can say is that we're sometimes fooled, by what you might call recency bias, right? By the fact that the silence at their 3.8 children per woman, we tend to think of that as having been the norm. It's a little bit of recency bias. And that, only the, Gen X and the boomers and millennials have seen really declining fertility because of birth control. That's declining sharply. But this is probably not the case. It's probably been going on for quite a long time. And we've been fooled by the fact that we have the baby boomers, right? This huge demographic that's the result of a very high birth rate within living memory. I guess, there's not a lot of silence left, but there's a lot of baby boomers left. So I'm going to say within living memory. But it's fooling us into thinking that, it has to be contraception that's the answer, where it actually is potentially something else. And as I hinted, Kurtz suggests that there's a different fundamental cause. And I think this is where his argument gets really interesting. And that is status, which manifests differently, in different places, through different proximate causes, but he thinks is the ultimate cause in the drop in fertility. All right, so what do we mean as when we talk about status, right? So status, really simply, let me bust out my highlighter here, is your perceived standing within the group, right? So how do you get status, right? You move up and down, in terms of formal and informal hierarchies that you're a part of, and it's pretty universally acknowledged if you look at anthropology that gaining status, that status games and moving your status higher is a motivation for individuals. Most people want more status, and it is a motivation for people to participate in society productively. Okay, now how do you get status? Well, you get status, maybe I'll go back to my pen here, through approved behaviors, right? Achievements, etiquette, defending the group, and through possession of recognized status symbols, title, wealth, important physical assets, right? There's a reason, if you go into some of the richer neighborhoods in Edmonton or anywhere, right, there's a reason that people will park their Audi, right, on the driveway instead of in the garage. They have a 3-car garage, and yet the Audi or the, sports car, the Corvette, maybe the BMW, though I tend to think BMWs aren't worth the status they used to be. Whatever the hot car is, right? There's a reason that people park it out on the driveway and not in the garage, because in the garage, no one can see your fancy status symbol, right? So to get status, you have to do things that are seen as good by your community and avoid things that are seen as bad, because those will lower your status, or acquire things that lead to you being seen as having status. Okay, so his argument is that the net status outcomes of having a child is lower than the status outcomes of various competing undertakings, right? So the idea here is, life is a sort of zero-sum game. In order to do something like have a child, you have to give up certain other opportunities, and other things will bring you more status ultimately than having a child, right? So for example, and especially he says this is the case for women, pursuing a successful career net is going to bring you higher social status than having a child or many children. So as a result, having kids ends up being deprioritized. And the whole, the title of the piece is, "It's embarrassing to be a stay-at-home mom." And later in the piece, the argument he makes is that, when you go to, say, like a party and people ask you what you do, right, that saying that you are a, stay-at-home parent, right, in this case he says a stay-at-home mom because that's the more typical one, ultimately is like, kind of a net status lower, right? If you were to say that you were, a lawyer, your partner at a law firm, that would immediately put you at a higher, status then, so here you'd have lawyer high and stay-at-home mom low, or Saham, would be low. Okay, so pursuit of status, he says, is the primary causal factor if the pursuit of status is the primary causal factor suppressing fertility, we should see, some combination of these 6 things. Number 1, and this is probably the most important part of this case, interventions which increase the status of parents would cause an increase in fertility. So basically, if somehow you could raise the status of being a parent, you would see rises in fertility. Communities in which parents are higher status would have higher fertility. We'll take a look at some arguments for that as well. High status individuals who become parents would cause others to follow suit, right? So if someone is seen as really high status and they have a child or many children, that would cause other people to emulate this. Okay, this one. Social strivers. People who are looking to increase their social status will forego children for higher status objectives. All right, status secure people. The established elites should have higher fertility rates because they're already at the top of the ladder. So for them, having more children is less likely to cause a loss of status. And then groups with unusual status symbols will see, or status systems, will see unusual fertility patterns. Okay. So he points out kind of one major case, and then I have added another one that is similar to the argument. Okay, so he talks about the case of Georgia. And here we are talking, little Georgia that sits in the North Caucasus, right? Just kind of south of the southern part of Russia. That Georgia, not the American state where they have peaches, Georgia. So, just to be clear, right? Georgia. So, Georgia. Again, Georgia's an interesting case. It's a really small country. I think Georgia's population is somewhere around 4 or 5 million people. Geographically, it's very, very small. It's relatively ethnically homogenous outside of a couple of regions like Ossetia and Abkhazia. But that's too deep a dive. It's relatively homogenous, so it makes for an interesting kind of case. And coming out of the Soviet period, Georgia's birth rate was relatively low, like a lot of other post-Soviet kind of states. You were seeing fertility, sitting somewhere in the, 1.3 to 1.8 range. Okay, so what happened though, in the mid-2000s, Georgia spiked its birth rate and actually jumped from kind of non-replacement fertility a little bit past replacement fertility. I think they peaked out at about 2.3. And today, I think it sits at about 2.0. So it would be just below replacement fertility in Georgia, but still, really, really close. Okay, now the cause, and this is something that people sort of universally agree, I guess not universally, but broadly agree, was the cause of the spike in fertility is that, because it happened right around the same time, the patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church, right, so the head of the Georgian Orthodox Church, Ilya II, announced that he would baptize and become godfather to all third children and onward, right? So, child number 3 plus would be baptized by, and then he would be the godfather of that child. So essentially what that does is it brings this person who would be one of the most, this is like the Pope in Georgia, right? It would be one of the most prominent figures in Georgian society, essentially sort of becomes part of your family. And what happened is births of third children boomed. Now, to be very clear, it's not like everybody started having 3 children. You don't actually need that in order to, get your fertility rate past replacement. But essentially, what you have to do in order to get fertility past replacement in a society is you have to take a bunch of people that were going to have 0 kids and bump them to 1, and a much smaller number that we're going to have 1 kid, you have to bump them up to 2, and then an even smaller number you have to bump up to 3, and if you can bump up even a small percentage of those up to 4, very quickly that kind of stacks, right? So you only have to get some percentage of each of these groups to move up 1 child in terms of fertility, and boom, you've hit replacement fertility. Okay, now, Ilya's kind of offer to, baptize and become godfather to a bunch of Georgian children, 3rd children and onward, was broadly seen as a religious phenomenon, right? Our religious leader is telling us have more kids, and people responded. But what Kurtz suggests, and I think this is where his argument is really interesting, is actually, he suggests it's a status phenomenon, right? Ilya's kind of like a celebrity. It would be kind of like if, I don't know, let's say in Canadian society, we don't have a direct analog, I don't think, but let's say somebody really famous, I don't know, let's say Connor McDavid, right, said that, Yasmin, I love your face there. Connor McDavid said that, for every 3rd child born, he would be the godparent, in Edmonton. He would be the godparent of that 3rd child. So suddenly, right, you have your 3rd child, and Connor McDavid shows up, and, you get to take some pictures with Connor McDavid. And then, every year on their birthday, Connor McDavid comes for a visit or at least sends a birthday card, right? Or something like that. So all of a sudden you've got all, and you get let's say a signed Connor McDavid jersey for the kid at every stage of life. Okay, your reaction and the kind of sharp gasp sort of illustrates the point. And actually, Edmonton is a pretty small community, not nearly as homogenous as Georgia, but you would see maybe a few people, go from 2 to 3. Or 3 to 4, right, in terms of children that they had to take advantage of the Connor McDavid thing. And why? It's not because, it's because being connected to someone high status, like Connor McDavid, a celebrity, would make you, would raise your status, right? All of a sudden, you're kind of more special by osmosis, right? Or by connection to that person. Okay. So it raises your status to be connected to a celebrity. Okay, and people also emulate celebrities, right? So let's say, this is the Taylor Swift argument. I don't think Taylor Swift is going to have 3 or more kids, but let's say Taylor Swift all of a sudden, pops out 3 babies in the next few years after her marriage to that football player. What's his name? I can't remember. I'm sorry. I don't care enough to remember these facts. The gym teacher, as she put it. That's all I remember is her tweet. What is his name? Travis Kelce. Thank you. I know you all know. Okay, Travis Kelce. Right, if she has 3 kids all of a sudden, well, maybe then people are like, wow, Taylor seems really happy. I should have 3 kids as well, right? Or I should have a few kids. Let's put it that way. So that happens in Georgia, right? So raise status, potentially, you might ultimately raise the birth rate. And that seems to be what happened in Georgia. Okay. Okay, so yes. I mean, we saw kind of consistent drops in fertility starting like in the mid to late 19th century, right? So somewhere between 1850 and 1890. It's not the same everywhere. Like for England and Wales, it's right around 1890, that it happens. However, kind of mid-19th century forward, and this is true in Canada as well, we saw declining fertility rates across a lot of Western countries. And then, the silents, they are atypical in the fact that they have a lot more kids, right? They're 3.8, this is why the baby boom is called the baby boom, because all of a sudden you have all of these kids being born. And that's why they've been so influential, because they're so much bigger than the 2 generations before them and the 2 generations after them as well, right? So they maintain the power, to elect whatever politician they feel most inclined to. and other things, right? So yes, they are atypical. All right. Now, Mongolia. So a weird topic shift. Mongolia. Mongolia, though, also an interesting kind of case study. Also a relatively small country, though it's bigger than Georgia. Also kind of aberrant in terms of its fertility. So, Mongolia, right? Country sandwiched between, Russian Siberia. Russia's right here with its 1.8 children per woman, roughly. And, China, and you see the different regions of China here, right? With all their varying fertilities. And you've got the Koreas here, in the north, 1.97. That's not South Korean fertility anymore. Now it's like more 0.65. But anyway, right? All these different countries with, various levels of fertility. Japan at about 1.4. Mongolia kind of sticks out, right? With its red hot 2.64 fertility rate. Okay, so why is Mongolia different? Well, Kurt doesn't argue. Actually, he doesn't talk about Mongolia. I picked this up from other places. Mongolia is kind of weird. Mongolia's fertility has consistently been, 2 to 3 times higher than its neighbors and has been increasing for 20 years. Now, this isn't because Mongolia is unique compared to the places around it. It is, has comparable incomes. Its GDP per capita is roughly the same as both Russia and China. It's urbanized, right? It's, most of the population lives in its largest cities. It's not especially religious, right? It's primarily Buddhist and non-religious, owing to its long history of being, sandwiched, a communist country sandwiched between the communist Soviet Union and, the People's Republic of China. But it has this weird thing where motherhood, especially, is celebrated. And Mongolia gives an award, and it gives this award out every year to each mother of 4 or more, called the Order of Maternal Glory. And I kid you not, that is actually the name of this award. It is I asked one of our grad students who is Mongolian, and whose mother is a mother of 6 and has received the Order of Maternal Glory, that in fact basically translates from Mongolian as the Order of Maternal Glory. So they get an award. Do I have the picture of it? Oh, I don't. The picture of it's funny, right? Because every year the president of Mongolia tours around Mongolia, and they have these like government centers in Mongolia. And so he will do this ceremony at this government center, and inevitably it looks like this big concrete block because it was built, up to Soviet standards. And next to it, there's a statue of Genghis Khan, right? Because it's Mongolia, right? And Mongolia is like Genghis Khan, big ugly concrete building. And then, these mothers go and they get their picture taken with the president, and they receive their Order of Maternal Glory. Oh, and also $60. Of all the weird things. But what it seems to have done, and at least this is the argument of people looking at it, is it has made, because, it would be, here it's, again, it'd be like the mayor or the king of England, right? Coming and being like, congratulations, you've had 4 children. What a glorious thing you've done for our country. But it increases the status of women who've had 4 or more children. And it's important, right? You get to get a medal from the president of the country. And apparently that's important. Okay, I haven't seen a question slide in a spell. Did I forget to put them in? So Inner Mongolia. Oh, so Inner Mongolia is actually part of China. And so Mongolia is the country proper, which I can circle, but it's in red. Or my pen stopped working. Sad pen. Why have you stopped working? What will I do without my precious pen? I will reset it and see if it works now. There we go. Mongolia there, right? Inner Mongolia here. Inner Mongolia is actually part of China. It's not actually part of Mongolia, right? It's a geographic thing. Okay, that's a really interesting question. So yes, that's why Inner Mongolia is part of China. So they don't have an order of maternal glory. Is the godfather thing more of a commitment/responsibility in the Orthodox Church? Oh, I mean, it should be at least. I don't know how involved Ilya actually is in the day-to-day lives of Georgian children, right? Like certainly, like I know Orthodox people and they take the godparent thing very seriously, but that's here, and I can't answer that question very good. It's probably more just a name thing because I'm guessing the head of the whole Georgian Orthodox Church doesn't show up. Okay, now the opposite may also be true, right? If we prize, high or give high status to people who are, childless but have other accomplishments, it might have a very negative effect on fertility overall. So I don't know. I put Taylor here. I know I used her as an example. She doesn't have any kids yet, so we can still use her as an example, right? Super prominent person, seen as incredibly successful, and she is, of course. But she's, 36 or 37 and childless. So that could lead people to conclude this is the kind of thing that you want to pursue. But we can look at, lots of other examples. South Korea is a really interesting one. And I'll talk about it a little bit more on the next slide. But essentially when we look at South Korean society, virtually all highest status people are childless. We see this a lot in the US too, and we see it like in the leadership class of a lot of European countries, right? And until recently, Olaf Scholz was the chancellor in Germany. Emmanuel Macron is still the president of France, at least for the moment, might not last very long, both childless, right? So we see a lot of childless people in really prominent positions. Okay, so strivers, right? Do social strivers have fewer children? Okay, this is a kind of a complicated argument to some extent, but I think it mostly makes sense. So what do we see, let's say, in the West, right? We see it in other places as well. Demand for education, especially at elite institutions, is at an all-time high, right? You want to send your kid to get a good college education because you want them to be high status, right? You want them to have a good job, a good career, so that they are kind of, doing well, which is partially a status thing, right? Great job, part of a status game. Okay, resource-limited parents increasingly report that they would rather have fewer children who secure positions in elite universities than more children who do not, right? So here, it's better to have one child go to Harvard than 10 children, or let's say 3. Let's be reasonable. 3 children, go to community college, right? Why? Well, because Harvard is Harvard, and Oxford is Oxford, and the University of Toronto is the University of Toronto. No, I don't think anyone's like, I really need my child to go to the University of Toronto. Maybe they do. Okay, but why? Having a child at an elite university confers more status benefits than just having a child, right? And I think that's pretty obvious, right? Why do parents work so hard to send their kid to a place like Harvard or Princeton or Yale? Because it is important, right? Because they view it as conferring status not only to them, their child, but also to them, right? Yeah, I remember my dentist when I was growing up. His son managed to get into Harvard. Weirdly, I needed a root canal around the same time. No, I'm kidding. His son managed to get into Harvard, right? And all of a sudden the dentist's office is plastered in Harvard banners, and his wife, who is also, the office manager, is wearing a Harvard sweatshirt, right? Why? Well, his son got into Harvard, and good for him. I never got into Harvard. I never actually tried, but I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have gotten into Harvard anyway. Right? Status. And he only had one kid, and, like I said, that dental office definitely, paid for someone's Harvard education. Okay, let's talk about South Korea. South Korea is a really, really interesting social kind of example, right? So East Asian cultures do put a lot of emphasis on status. They're very status-oriented kind of cultures in a lot of ways, right? So South Korea, the culture really incentivizes, I'm going to highlight this, incentivizes people to take whatever measures necessary to ensure their status is as high as possible. And you'll notice total fertility as of 2023 in South Korea, 0.68, which means 2 generations on, you're going to have about half the number of South Koreans as you do today, right? So that population should divide in half, which, you know, is a huge problem. Okay, so it is really hard in South Korea to get into a high status career. The only really high status careers in South Korea are with employers in a small number of companies called, I can never pronounce this, and Korean students have told me how to pronounce this like 100 times, and I never get it right. Chaebols, I think, is how it is pronounced. But these are these large, horizontally integrated companies in South Korea. You think Samsung, LG, Hyundai, Kia, and there's a few other ones. I just don't remember what they are off the top of my head. So, to get into working at a Chaebol, you need to go to very specific universities in South Korea, and competition is extremely fierce. It all comes down to getting basically a perfect score in national exams, right, to get into one of the schools that's going to get you a job at one of these companies, right? And if you don't, you're down the social ladder. Now, it's so crazy in South Korea, right, that on the day of these exams, they do things like shut down the airports, right? So flights get canceled, right? So that nothing is distracting people. You also see a crazy spike in suicide rates amongst young people taking the exams because the competition is super fierce. Now, I didn't talk about it in education, but one thing that happens in South Korea is they have these incredibly competitive academic systems. And South Korean students score really, really high in tests like PISA. However, essentially, their kids go to school essentially from dawn till dusk, right? And this is, a little 15 hours study in one day, kill me. It's the reason why our Korean students, suicide, right? So not perfect English, but you get the point. I pulled this off Google Images. Okay, so what does it look like, right? They go often because the whole goal of you as a parent is to get your kid a perfect score on that national exam, so they get into these programs so they get that high status job. So what does a South Korean student's day look like? Well, in the morning, you have tutoring, then school, then tutoring, then sleep, lather, rinse, repeat, right? That is the life of a South Korean student. Now, this is not free, it costs money, right? You pay to send your kid to these tutors, and the better the tutor, the more you pay, right? And the better the tutor is usually defined by how many of the students that went to this tutor ultimately ended up scoring that perfect score and getting into those elite programs. So what happens to parents? Well, they have a kind of a choice, right? Or adults have a choice. Either you sacrifice your status, right, to have a child and to pay for extensive tutoring, right? So you're going to sacrifice, your outward wealth because you're going to be pumping all your money into these kids. And what does that look like? Well, it's a lot of money. So you are investing a ton to getting your kid here, right? To getting into those programs. You're investing a lot of your capital. And so what happens, it's probably not likely that you're going to be able to get 2 or 3 kids into that. So people make one of a few choices. Either they have no children and they focus on their own status, or they have one child, right? And they pour their resources into that one child to get them that extra tutoring and get them those perfect scores. And like I said, there's a lot of despair in the system. It's people sometimes, I'll put it this way, everybody when they want to like look at how to reform the education system looks at like Finland. No one ever says we should do what the Koreans do because it's crazy, right? No one is ever like, yes, let's send our children to school morning, noon, and night. And make an exam so important that if they score badly on it, they kill themselves, right? Okay, so social strivers, right? We'll have fewer children. South Korea seems to prove that point, right? People want to increase their status or increase the status of their children at least, and so they have smaller families. I didn't set a clock here, so I have no idea what time it is. Okay, I'm good. All right, we can do this one pretty quick. His other point, right? Status secure people, established elites have higher fertility. In the US, the ultra rich, families with an average income of over $1 million, he says, are the only demographic with replacement fertility at 2.15 children per woman, right? So healthy, above, like they'll maintain its population. The elites are going to be fine. They'll stay where they are. From 1 million to 500,000 annual income, right, which is a lot of money, fertility drops to 1.85, right? So still high, but and above the American average of 1.787. But even though they could afford more children, they don't have them, right? Like at $500,000 a year, you could probably afford to have as many children as you want in the United States, right? That's a lot of money, but they still have relatively low fertility. So status secure people, you know, if we say the richest of the rich, $1 million of income or more a year, they're above replacement fertility, but everyone below that, you know, it drops. Okay, so, and here we get to our status types. So you have, how do you get status, right? Well, one of the ways is dominance, coerced by force or by fear, by virtue, right? You know, you're somehow so moral and wonderful that your status gets elevated by, you know, being conspicuously dutiful, obedient, and moralistic, or by success, right? Achievement of closely specified outcomes. Now, what Kurtz says, and again, I think this is basically correct, in the pre-Enlightenment era, right, so prior to the late 17th, 18th centuries, women, derived status from birth, right, so from her social class, and from things like virtue, virginity, piety, and motherhood. And most often this was sort of conferred by the church, right, whether Protestant or Catholic. Increasingly, though, as we move through the Enlightenment, this kind of shifted, right? And increasingly, it came in for things like dominance games, and particularly success, you know, in dominance and in success, kind of competitions in dominance and success. And what we get, you know, from the Enlightenment, for all the good it does, is we start to get a focus on meritocracy, right? So things like nobility, you know, social class being where you draw, you know, virtue, right? If you're a noble, you're a noble, right? If you're royalty, you're royalty. If you're a peasant, you're a peasant, right? We lose all of that, probably for the best. If you've seen the royals, they're not all that special. But it shifts it to what you accomplish, right? And therefore, you know, we shift from things like virtue to success and to some extent, you know, dominance in terms of how you get social status. And what that brings is declines in fertility, right? So virtue, especially virtue and dominance games, don't require a trade-off with fertility, but especially success does. Because, you know, when you have a child, you're sacrificing part of the time where you could be achieving things for raising that child, and you're going to pour resources into them, which takes you away. Yeah, can we not talk about Brigitte Macron? It's really creepy. I know Candace Owens says she's a man. I don't think that's true. I only saw that because Twitter told me so. I don't actually follow Candace Owens. But I do think it's amusing that she said that she's being sued for saying Brigitte Macron is a man. But yeah, he's married to his teacher. Oh my God. It's so creepy to be married to your teacher who's 25 years older than you. There's just something wrong with that. Macron. Okay. All right. So, according to Kurtz, and again, I think there might be something to this. Parenting is low status, right? And he suggests that, when asked, what do you do? A good answer is to lead with an established career, right? A bad answer, status-wise, is I'm a mother or, I'm a stay-at-home parent. So what he says is our economically driven success regime ultimately drives down fertility. And this has real effects, right? I've shown you all sorts of fertility numbers. But, this kind of interesting poll done by Cardis in October 2024 suggested that half of Canadian women are having fewer children than they say they want. And largely, why is there, they started having children late in order to establish their careers. Okay. Now, this just came out today. I saw this on Twitter. You don't have this slide, but I thought it was interesting because I thought it added potentially a bit of a wrinkle to this whole argument. And maybe it's politics. Maybe politics is another one. And I'm going to put that as a question because this is, Financial Times analysis. So this is not some fly-by-night operation, Financial Times, right? Of U.S. General Social Survey and this is Gallup World Values Survey data. And what they found was the average number of children born to people with different political ideologies. And what you see is it's declined across the board, right? However, conservatives and progressives started at roughly the same place, kind of late 1970s. And again, this is US. Late 1970s, right? You're talking 2.7 children per woman. Now, conservatives, up to 2024, declined to, 2.4. And progressives, declined, I believe it's about 1.7, right? And so that's the US only. And then the developed world, right, going back to 1995, conservatives have dropped, in terms of how many children, by about 0.2, while, progressives have dropped a lot more. So potentially, right, and this is, again, this just came up today and I threw it in there because I thought it'd be interesting. Does someone's politics play a role in how many children they have? And I mean, if this is the case, how to put this, will conservatives eventually just sort of breed their way to dominance? I don't know. That is a thought and a half to have on a Monday afternoon, I suppose. Okay, how much time do I have? I have 3 minutes. Maybe I'll just introduce Kearney's book, and we'll kind of go from there. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is this, the two-parent privilege. This is a really good book, right? So if you like economics, and you all should, because economics is super interesting, and we should all read more economics. Melissa Kearney's an economist. I believe she's at MIT, though I can't remember right at this moment. And she wrote this very interesting book called The Two-Parent Privilege. And you see the subtitle, right? How the decline in marriage has increased inequality, lowered social mobility, and what we can do about it. And that's the thesis of the book, right? The decline in marriage has increased inequality, lowered social mobility. What we can do about it. She has a whole chapter on policy interventions. It's a really, really interesting kind of take. What do I have on the next slide? Okay, I'll just tell you a little bit more about the book because I only have like 2 minutes. The introduction for the book is really a kind of interesting sort of story. Kearney, right, well-regarded economist, we already talked about her with that North Dakota shale example a little bit, goes off to a conference of economists where they're talking about families. And one of the things that she says is that talking about family structure, weirdly, is kind of taboo. Even in economist circle. Specifically, because everybody wants to be careful about stigma, right? And stigmatization, especially of single mothers, right? Not to say that somehow single mothers are doing a bad job, but what Kearney says is that she does a presentation and she kind of goes against the grain and suggests Well, what's really clear in the economics data, and we all know it, she says to her fellow economists, is that two-parent families are inherently a superior arrangement, for getting kids across the finish line in good shape, right? For, raising children, it's a pretty simple equation, right? Two parents bring more resources to the life of their children than a single parent, right? So they have more money, they have more time, they can split tasks, and we'll talk about all these things in turn. And we all know this, but it's kind of verboten to talk about it in the social sciences because, for one, it suggests that, this relatively traditional social institution, marriage, actually, and here we can take our sort of functional, if you know sociology, right, you can go your Durkheim way and talk in a functionalist way. Marriage seems to provide an important social function, helping, nurturing and raising children in a pretty good environment, and it seems to do a relatively good job of this as compared to other social institutions. And you end up dividing people into the marriage haves and the marriage have-nots. And a lot of social inequality in the US seems to be amongst the marriage have-nots. Okay, why don't we talk about that next time? I'll try to blast through Kearney's book. It's a really interesting take. Lots of numbers and charts and data, and I'm sorry, but it's quite interesting. All right.